Note, there is one more question at the end. After I say that it's over and be happy, don't be happy yet, because there's one more question that I forgot to answer. And then, like 2 hours later, I came back and answered it. So just remember that when I say, the first time I say be happy, don't be happy yet. And don't turn off the video because there's one more question that I answer after that. So don't be happy yet. Hello and welcome to episode 54 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and this is your host's beverage. And I am kind of tired or sleepy today for a relatively perverse reason, partly because of a relatively perverse reason anyway, and that is I am not a morning person. I've never been a morning person. I don't particularly trust morning people, in fact. But because of my new job, I have to get up at 5 in the morning pretty much every morning. Every morning that I intend to go to work anyway. And on weekends, I like to sleep in. I mean, that's like one of the greatest luxuries in life, is just being able to sleep in and just wake up whenever you feel like waking up instead of being slammed or jolted awake by an alarm clock. And unfortunately, my body has just gotten used to getting up at 5. So I go to bed late. I can stay up late on weekends, and then I get up around 5 or wake up around 5 or 6 and can't get back to sleep again, just because I'm used to getting up at that god-awful hour, practically still in the middle of the night. But I'm still quite willing to do my best answering questions, and I pretty much have to do them on a weekly basis now, just because more people are asking more questions, which is good. I mean, that's why I'm here, but still, we're going to make this, maybe not every time, but I think it's going to be once a week more often than once every 2 weeks, for the foreseeable future, I guess. Let's just see how it goes. So, the first question is from Bodhisattva 969. And Bodhisattva 969 says, what would you say are the most important things for a Theravada layperson to do or practice who doesn't have a Sangha nearby? Sila, meditation, which one, reading the Majjhima Nikaya, etc. And how can he grow in the Dhamma without a Sangha, or is it even possible to achieve awakening or only a better reincarnation? Well, I mean, if you're a solitary Buddhist, and I mean, it's not necessarily a great handicap. I mean, if you read some Buddhist texts, especially, for example, the Kagawisana Sutta or the Rhinoceros Horn Discourse, it does say that the solitary life is the best for practicing Dhamma. In fact, there's also a Burmese Buddhist saying, it's Tapataya Nabazaga Thomba Alaga, which means one monk is Dhamma, 2 monks is conversation, and 3 monks is just worthless. So, I mean, that would apply to lay people that are practicing as well as monks, I suppose. So, what would be the most important things for a Theravada lay person to do or practice who doesn't have a Sangha nearby? Well, keeping Sila, and I can say meditating. I don't meditate much anymore. Mostly it's like spontaneous walking meditation when I meditate now. Sometimes like do a little bit of mantra. That's about as far as it goes. And I may go into greater detail discussing this, possibly even today. After this, I'm going to be doing a show with Brian Rue, and we may be discussing that very topic, so I may direct you to that. Yeah, I mean, that would be the 3 main things for a Buddhist layperson to do, either alone or with a Sangha, is, keep the precepts, meditate as well as you are, able to do. Be generous, dana, give alms. if not to monks walking in alms round in front of your house, which may not happen very often in non-Buddhist countries, but just whoever needs the money and isn't just going to blow it on drugs, that sort of thing. You see a homeless person who's, maybe they're not a drug addict, and you're just going to be contributing to their drug use. I mean, that might not be the purest generosity, but it depends on your mental states. And also studying Dhamma. So yeah, reading the Majjhima Nikaya, reading the Sutta Nipata, reading a few verses from the Dhammapada every night before you go to bed, just kind of having your last awaking thoughts about Dhamma before you roll over and go to bed and start thinking about something else. So that'd be the main thing. So yeah, just a review, keeping sila, meditating, practicing generosity to the extent that you are able, and studying Dhamma. And that'd be reading text, preferably translations of the Pali texts, or in the original Pali, of course, if you can read Pali. And so I think I answered that question, so I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Maitreya Buddha, who you would think wouldn't have to ask questions. And Maitreya Buddha says, why is laying down forbidden in Buddhism? Isn't one of the most common Buddha statues the Buddha laying down on his side with his head resting on his hand right before attaining Parinibbana? So this is kind of a misconception. I was talking about never lying down in the previous Q&A, and that is a Dhutanga practice, which is one of the 13 standardized optional extra ascetic practices that a monk can practice. And so it's purely optional. The Buddha himself lay down. Probably most of the Buddha's disciples slept in a prone, horizontal position. So yeah, I mean, the Buddha, when he died, according to the tradition, he was lying between two sal trees probably on like one of his robes, it's kind of spread out for him to lie on, and he lay on that, and he died in a lying position. That's why the Parinibbana mudra, the Buddha lying on his side, it's in the so-called lion's position. That's representing his death, his exit from samsara, so to speak. And the monks who do lie down, they're not even supposed to admit to lying down, because it's a Dhutanga practice. Dhutangas are supposed to be kept secret. It's like you tell your preceptor or your teacher or some other senior monk, you can take the Dhutangas, officially in his presence, but you don't go around telling other people. And I think I've told this story before. I think it's in the Visuddhimagga, about two monks who happened to be sharing a cabin one night. And one of them had been doing the sitting practice. He didn't sleep in a horizontal position. He would sit up and sleep. And so the two monks in the middle of the night are, sleeping, or, almost sleeping or something. And then there's a lightning storm, and a flash of lightning lights up the inside of the cabin, and the monk who's lying down can see that the other monk is in a sitting position. So he asks him, "Do you do the sitting practice?" And then immediately the monk who was sitting there lies down and says no. And then the very next night he just starts doing the sitting practice again, because you're supposed to conceal your ascetic practices, at least the concealable ones, the way a thief conceals his ill-gotten gains, so to speak. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question then. I think I answered that. The next question is from Raja Kumara, son of the king. Something along those lines, the boy of the king. And Raja Kumara says, do you have any personal experience with Kanda Parita when you were a monk? How did you handle when you were surrounded by snakes, mosquitoes, etc.? Well, my main personal experience with the Kanda Parita is I would chant it every day. It was just the tradition in the Taungpulu tradition. The monks chant the Khanda Sutta, which I believe is in the Vinaya, in the rules of monastic discipline. A monk gets bitten by a snake and dies, so the Buddha teaches the monks, you chant this sutta, and it will protect you from being bitten by snakes. And even if you get bitten, you won't die. And I liked the Khanda Sutta. It was one of my favorite Paritas just because I like snakes, I like animals, and the whole purpose of the Khanda Sutta is just sending metta to not only the 4 families of snakes, but also to multi-legged creatures, 4-legged creatures, 2-legged creatures, and legless creatures, which is the snakes themselves, plus I guess like worms or something. But I really didn't need to send metta systematically to snakes, because I just like snakes. Like when I was in Burma, if I would see a snake, I'd be happy. I'd just feel piti, like joy, when I would see a snake, especially if I saw a big one. I mean, almost stepping on a viper or something. Yeah, that's startling. But I never had any bad feelings towards snakes. I just like snakes. And the first time I ever saw a cobra, especially when it was like standing up on its hind legs, so to speak, with its hood spread and everything, I was just in a state of rapture. I think there's a good chance, assuming that rebirth happens, that way, way back in prehistoric times, I was some kind of a shaman in northwestern India who worshipped cobras or something. Mosquitoes, and even worse than mosquitoes, were the biting flies. I really didn't like those. I'd cuss them out. I would cuss at insects. And I think they would be inclined to bite me even if I chanted the Khanda Sutta wholeheartedly on a regular basis. But yeah, my only real experience with the Khanda Parita is chanting it and also finding it in the Vinaya itself. It is a canonical Parita. So I'll just move on to Raja Kumara's next question. And he says, in the Anguttara Nikaya 467, Ahi Metta Sutta, which is metta for snakes, there is a story where a monk went to meditate in the forest and he died after being bitten by a snake. When the Buddha found about this, he told other monks, quote, "Monks, that monk did not radiate thoughts of loving kindness toward the 4 royal tribes of snakes. Monks, had he done so, that monk would not have died of a snake bite," unquote. There is also a story of Ajahn Fuang, who was Ajahn Thanissaro's teacher, who drove away a snake with thoughts of metta. What's your thoughts and experience on this? Well, I mean, I don't know how you would drive away somebody with loving kindness. I mean, maybe drive away is not the best way of putting it. But my thoughts on, yeah, I mean, if you have, and one reason why I was never afraid of snakes is because I really just spontaneously gushed metta towards snakes. I didn't have to do it systematically as a practice. It just happened spontaneously. And so I've really never been afraid of snakes. I mean, you can be startled. Like you have to go out at night to pee, and it's dark, and you step on a stick or something that they kind of, it's sort of a bent stick, so that when you step on one end, the other end kind of slaps upwards or makes a rattling sound or something because there's like dead leaves stuck to it or something. And yeah, I mean, it can really startle you. But aside from that, I mean, just not wanting to get bitten by a Russell's viper. Yeah, I mean, I've never really had problems with snakes. I've always liked snakes. So my thoughts and experience on this, I really don't have a whole lot of experience. I mean, I've got lots of experience with snakes, but I don't have experience with, trying to protect myself from snakes, because I just like snakes. And you just bear in mind that a snake, I mean, aside from the occasional Russell's viper, I got chased by a Russell's viper once. It was a little baby one about this long, and it's just like lunging at me, like chasing me down the road. But for the most part, if you leave them alone, doesn't matter if it's scorpions, spiders, snakes, whatever it is, as a general rule, if you leave them alone, they're going to leave you alone. They only bite or attack if they feel threatened. So, I mean, sometimes you can just accidentally act in a threatening manner. You're like taking wood off the wood pile and there's a snake underneath, and it feels, alarmed because all of a sudden its hiding place has been dismantled. But as a general rule, just bear that in mind, and it helps you not to have fear or hatred I mean, you still have to have caution, of course, but the fear and the hatred is just irrelevant. It's just unnecessary. It's just counterproductive. So I guess there's one animal mentioned in the Khanda Sutta. Now, since we're talking about the Khanda Sutta, and I can't remember what it is, I should have looked it up before. It's, I think that the official Burmese explanation of this animal, and I'm sorry I can't remember the Pali name for it, but they say that it's a house gecko. And why you would need protection from house geckos, I don't know. Although some monks offer the idea that when a house gecko craps into water, the water becomes poisonous. But I think it would be some kind of wasp. Sarisapa. It translates into something like arrow being. So, but I'm rambling. I ramble a lot. So I think I'll just move on to the next question. Maybe he asked the wrong person about like protection from snakes, because I just feel naturally protected just because I just genuinely like snakes, especially big ones. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from the Arya Swasti Project. And the Arya Swasti Project says, "Greetings, Panyo. Since as Buddhists we don't believe in any kind of God, is it possible that if enough believers of Christianity or any other mainstream religion gave enough credence to their belief in a God, that it would actually create the God they believe in?" And that's an interesting idea. I have kind of toyed with this idea myself, and I was told by a knowledgeable pagan that this kind of God, that it exists because of the belief of all these people. It's their faith in this being just causes this being to exist in some metaphysical way. That is called an egregore, which is kind of reminds me of manticore or something. And I think that's possible. Especially, if you read Lord of the Flies, the novel, forget the movies. They just completely did away with all the symbolic meaning of it. But Lord of the Flies, the idea, Lord of the Flies, the novel is about these kids on an island, but Lord of the Flies is the English translation of the name Beelzebub. And it's like the whole nature of the devil really is the point of this novel, even though most people who read it may be completely clueless that it's about the devil at all. But there's this monster in the story, and the point is that the devil is real, even though he doesn't have this discrete, individual existence. That he exists in this shadowy, dark part of the human mind. And you've got so many humans, you got an entire population of humans with this dark, shadowy part, that in a way, that dark, shadowy part is like a cell in this being, and then he's an accumulation of all these little dark, shadowy parts that makes this powerful, real being. And so there's that sort of thing too. And also, I do think it's possible that you can have sort of a being that's maybe on the verge of this version of reality, that has sort of like a weak, tenuous existence. But the more people that believe in it or are dedicated to it, that it strengthens that being and gives it a foothold in this version of reality. So there's that too. But getting to his question about can a god be like essentially an egregore? Yeah, I don't see why not. I'm no authority on this subject, but it does make sense to me that, in ancient Greece or Rome, where you've got literally millions of people believing in Apollo, for example, then their faith in Apollo could presumably, heal sicknesses, perform other kinds of so-called miracles, and they can have visions, they can hear him communications and so forth. And you get to a certain point where it just, you hesitate to just call it mass hallucination. For example, I'm not a Christian, obviously, and so I'm pretty skeptical that Jesus is, hearing prayers and answering prayers right now. He may be a deva in some high heaven realm. He may be a Brahma in some even higher heaven realm now. He may be a god at this point, but I don't consider him to be the only begotten son of, Jehovah God Almighty. But so many people have believed in Jesus, over the centuries, just fervently, without a shadow of a doubt. And there have been really wise, saintly people that have believed in Jesus that, they may have created a new Jesus. It may have little to do with, Yeshua, the carpenter's son who became the leader of John the Baptist's group and could, had some ability to work wonders and so forth. That this is like a different Jesus that's like an egregore, but nevertheless, you could say that in a sense he's real. It's strange. What kind of karma did Jesus of Nazareth make for himself? So, yeah, I hope I answered that question, but as I say, I'm no authority. So I'll just move on to the Arya Sawasti Project's next question, which is kind of an interesting one also. Have you ever found yourself disagreeing with any of the Buddha's teachings? And that's hard to answer because even though I've studied Theravada Buddhism, studied the Pali texts for 30 years as a monk, and to some degree before and after, it's difficult to know exactly what the Buddha did and did not teach. I do not consider the Pali Tipitaka to be a 100% accurate historical document, just with verbatim quotes of Gautama Buddha. There may be a few verbatim quotes in there. There may be quite a few, but I do not consider the Pali text to be reliable in conveying what the historical Gautama Buddha actually taught. So I definitely disagree with some of the teachings of Theravada Buddhism, or I'm just skeptical of them. So we can say that, but whether I'm disagreeing with what the Buddha really taught, or I'm just disagreeing with some later addition to the text is hard to say. So, and even then, it's like, I guess it's human nature. You read something in the text and you just don't want to believe it. Like the stories of fire-breathing dragons, for example. I can say, well, that is, it's an artifact of prehistoric North Indian cobra worship that turned into a kind of mythology and people believed in these. And so they wound up being added into the text partly as a kind of propaganda, so that the cobra worshippers would see that the Buddhists have authority over the cobras and so forth. So you can be skeptical, and it's not like I disagree with the Buddha. It's like, well, I'm skeptical of this, and I'm not so sure the Buddha actually taught it. Like the 12 Nidana theory of dependent co-arising. I do not accept that as what the Buddha really taught. I do not consider that to be his best explanation of what dependent co-arising was. I do think that it evolved over time, over maybe a century, and it sort of coalesced into this 12 Nidana theory. But with regard to the oldest texts, what I consider to be the oldest teachings, like, the core philosophy of the Atthakavagga, I accept that more easily than any other part of the Pali Tipitaka, and that's one reason why I was able to stay a monk for 30 years, even though I'm fairly skeptical of the reliability of the Pali Tipitaka, because what not only myself, but what other scholars, other so-called authorities claim to be, the most archaic, earliest teachings, those are the teachings that really resonate with me the most. So I probably have disagreed with some of the Buddhist teachings, probably out of my own foolishness, or because the Buddha was just giving lip service to, ancient Indian cosmology or something that was, he was a product of his culture. At least the outward form of the Buddha, sort of the samsaric manifestation of Gautama Buddha. I mean, it was a product of his culture, just like anybody else. And so he would say things that were in agreement with, common beliefs of the Iron Age Ganges Valley that people nowadays just don't accept. So there's a good chance of it, but it's hard to say exactly what the Buddha really did teach. So it may be that I'm disagreeing with lots of it. Like if the Burmese are correct and that the Pali Tipitaka is at least 98% just authentic historical documents, then yeah, I'm just a shameless heretic and I'll burn in hell for wrong view, pernicious wrong view. So yeah, it's kind of a hard question to answer because you can't really know with 100% certainty what is and is not the Buddhist teachings as you find it in the Pali texts. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Athena's Sigil. And Athena's Sigil says, would you consider yourself more of a conservative or libertarian? I know this is not a political channel, but you've mentioned it, politics, in earlier videos. Yeah, I dabble in a little bit of political trolling sometimes. The current blog that I'm not writing for as regularly as I was when I was a monk, it's got quite a lot of politics in it, in fact. Some of my older videos with Brian Rue also are very political, but I've taken down most of the edgy political stuff just because YouTube is very censorious. So, do I consider myself more of a conservative or libertarian? I see weaknesses of both conservatism and libertarianism. Conservatism, I mean, you can't just cling to the way things have been. Just cling to tradition. That's what a conservative does by definition, I suppose. They want to conserve what has led them, led their culture to its current state of greatness or semi-greatness or whatever. And I mean, you have to innovate sometimes. Like that was one of the strengths of the ancient Romans, is that they were traditionalist, fairly conservative. I mean, they're like fascistically conservative by my postmodern standards. But if they saw some other culture was doing things better than they were doing them, they would adopt that. And that's a good idea. I mean, if only for the sake of, the struggle for existence between societies and cultures, you can't let yourself get out-competed. So there has to be innovation. You just have to choose it carefully. So, I mean, conservatism is like a good default setting. You go with what has proven itself to work. I'm not a progressive, definitely. So conservatism is like a good default setting where you stay with what has worked, what has served your civilization well enough and led it to this point, up to now. But still you have to innovate. There has to be a certain amount of progress, quote unquote. But with regard to libertarianism, where everyone just follows their own conscience, it lacks cohesion. If everyone is just like scattershot, where they just do as they please, so long as they're not harming others. It's like, a libertarian, I assume, would believe that you have the right to do whatever you want to do, so long as you're not, infringing upon anybody else's well-being or like their physical well-being or their rights, that sort of thing. I mean, hurting someone's feelings, I assume most libertarians think that, it's okay to misgender somebody, for example. So it lacks the cohesive property of conservatism. I mean, you don't have like these traditions. Then, I mean, it makes everything loose, and also it's just not conducive to the strength of society, in my opinion. So, I mean, you have to have sort of like a compromise of conservatism, like traditions, core values. Like a system of values. And early America up until relatively recently was really strong in that regard. I mean, you could follow different religions, you could dress differently, you could do all kinds of different things, but still there were certain values like, the rights of the individual, and just America is, a good country, and, it promotes freedom and so forth, that those were values that strengthened America because it helped people to be patriotic and to love their country and to be willing to fight for their country. Whereas now, especially the left, is just trying to hate on America and get everyone in America to hate on America and just bring it down to the level of a third world country, apparently, as far as I can tell. So I guess what I would consider myself more than anything would be like a classical liberal. Not liberal in the American sense of left wing, but liberal in the sense of John Stuart Mill and his essay on liberty, where, there has to be a certain amount of, like traditional values and so forth, but still, so long as you've got enough of that to like cause the cohesion of the society and people to actually favor their own culture, their own society, then you can have like lots of liberty aside from that. So I guess I'd be a classical liberal, which comes closer to libertarian, I guess. There's a lot of overlap between classical liberals and libertarians, but I'm not particularly conservative. I have considered that, out of my desire to see America get itself out of this hole that it's been digging itself into, that I might be willing to take the hit and let America go back to just being like this, like Christianity oriented culture, even though I'm not a Christian, just for the sake of strengthening America again. I'd be willing to take a hit for the team in that case, I guess. But I also guess I'll be moving on to the next question here, and this is from Ludovic Balam. And Ludovic Balam gives the advance warning, sorry in advance, it's a weird question. And here's Ludovic Balam's weird question. Assuming a man with a regular heterosexual libido had sex with a woman for the first time out of mutual volition, and the man had low sexual craving, not toward her but in general, and that due to automatic sense restraint could not bring himself to finish the act physically or have any sustained craving, all else considered, did he make sexual karma considering he didn't have past experience, didn't crave it, but chose to attempt it and did penetrate? Well, there's a little bit of contradiction here, because at the beginning it says, assuming a man with a regular heterosexual libido. So, it might just be saying that he's not gay or something, but a regular heterosexual libido in a guy has the guy being horny some of the time. And, he'd be having craving to get his rocks off, preferably into a female. But, let's see here. Let's read these conditions. He's got the regular heterosexual libido. Kind of. That's seems kind of arguable if you read the rest of this. He has sex with a woman for the first time out of mutual volition. They're both willing. And the man had low sexual craving, not toward her, but in general. And that due to automatic sense restraint could not bring himself to finish the act physically or have any sustained craving, all else considered. Did he make sexual karma considering he didn't have past experience, didn't crave it? Well, there's still going to be sexual karma. It's not going to be as intense. It's not going to be as strong of karma as if he's just going for it and just, yelling exclamations and making loud noises so the neighbors are pounding on the walls and so forth. And then, I won't go into further details, but you can just imagine this on your own, I'm sure. At the very least, he had to have the volition to do it, and volition is karma. Karma is chetana. So to the extent that he was, wanting to do it, and he apparently, he wouldn't have done it if he didn't want to. He wasn't forced into it or anything. Maybe just out of curiosity, but still, it's kind of a casual desire to do it, just to see what it's like. So it'd be more subtle karma than the sex addict. But still, he'd be making some karma, so long as it was a volitional act, so long as he's not enlightened. And I assume, if you read the text, a fully enlightened being isn't going to want to have sex with anybody, not even with his own hand. So let's see, he could not bring himself to finish the act. Yeah, I mean, so even the sense restraint involved in that is there's a certain amount of karma involved because it's like this habitual, and to some degree it's kind of neurotic. I mean, I've experienced this sort of thing before, where I mean, you just this sense restraint that you're trained in as a monk is just no, 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 no. So that can become like an obstacle. I mean, for a monk, it's a useful obstacle, I suppose. But yeah, I think I answered the question. So I'm just going to move on to the next one here. And this is from Ketchup. And Ketchup says, what are ways to cultivate Samvega and Pasada constantly in the mind? Thank you, Panyabasa. Well, you're welcome, even though I haven't answered it yet. And I guess I should define the Pali terms here. Samvega is a sense of like spiritual urgency or alarm. You know, it's like I gotta practice. You know, you just feel this state of, you know, I can't waste my life. I'm gonna die someday. I gotta practice Dhamma while I've got the chance. And then Pasada is, I mean, literally means something like clarity. Sometimes it's translated as faith. I think Bhikkhu Bodhi prefers confidence, but it's just being like at peace and just clear about Dhamma. You know, it's like you are satisfied relatively. I mean, nothing is entirely satisfactory, but you know you're on the right track, and your beliefs and your practice are giving you comfort and sort of a spring in your step, and you're holding your head high, and your face is clear, and your mind is, you've got clarity on the issue of how to live your life or what to believe, that sort of thing. So Ketchup here is asking, what are ways to cultivate Samvega and Pasada constantly in the mind? Well, good luck trying to cultivate Samvega constantly. I mean, one time, well, twice actually, I went to see autopsies at the Mandalay City Morgue in Burma. That's a story all on its own. But I remember the first time I went in there, before I saw the autopsies, just walking through the morgue and just seeing, dead people lying on slabs. I mean, I won't go into all the details, but I remember when I walked outside, it was just a bright, sunny day, and there's kids playing and laughing, and there's this young teenage guy flirting with these girls, and these other girls walking along just chattering and giggling and so forth. And it's like, how can you be so, don't you know what's in this building right here? It's like, we're all gonna die. And that's Samvega, where you just get struck with this sense of urgency, like I just got to practice Dhamma. But the thing is, trying to cultivate that constantly, I mean, you can't be in a constant state of alarm because, I mean, you get used to stuff. Like, I used to have a human skeleton with all the joints, articulated with wires and stuff, sitting out in front of my cave. And I also had a human skull just inside the cave, and eventually it just becomes part of the furniture. It's just part of the background. It's like you got a picture on the wall. You've seen that picture 1,000 times. It hardly even registers in your mind. The same is true of skeletons and skulls and so forth. So I think, you'd have to change it up. You'd have to be coming up with new ways of jolting yourself into the state of spiritual urgency. And it may be one of the best ways that I can think of to cultivate Samvega is volunteer to do charitable work at like an old folks home, where you're seeing people near the ends of their lives. A lot of them are just in states of despair, or they're just semi-conscious. Their health is failing, that kind of a thing. Yeah, that might be one of the best ways of cultivating Samvega in the West, is just visiting old folks' homes and trying to help the old folks there. With regard to Pasada, the best way of cultivating Pasada is to practice Dhamma and just see from your own experience that it is helping you, is making you healthier, or mentally healthier anyway, happier and wiser. It's just the experiential knowledge that you're going in a good direction is the best way of cultivating this kind of clarity or confidence. So I hope I answered that question. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Jules. Wait a minute. Wait a minute here. Gosh, I think I attributed to the Arya Swasti project a question from Jules, because this question from Jules is, have you ever found yourself disagreeing with any of the Buddhist teachings? So, yeah, it's the same question, same exact question. So I assume it's from Jules. And to Jules, I apologize for attributing your question to the Arya Swasti project. And to the Arya Swasti project, I apologize for attributing your question to Jules, just in case. I'm covering my ass here. And just rewind 5 minutes or something. So I'll just move on to the next question here. And this is from Fred. And I'm not sure if this is a real question to be answered on this Q&A, because Fred sometimes throws in gratuitous question marks. It happens. And he likes just sort of tossing in ideas and feedback and so forth. But there is a question mark at the end of this. So I'm going to read it. It was in the comments under a Q&A. So he says, I heard Gandhabba can smell and hear. What's your thoughts? Well, I don't think they can smell your thoughts. I don't think thoughts have a smell unless you're having like an olfactory thought. Maybe. Yeah, I don't fully understand the part about the Gandhabbas probably do have a sense of smell. But I guess I should define Gandhabba. A Gandhabba is like a small g god that's just one level above the human level. They're in the realm of the four kings. And the four kings are the four kings guarding the various directions of the map of the earth. Like the snow dog is guardian of the north, according to Rush anyway. So the Gandhabbas are they're sort of like fairies. They're like heavenly musicians. They serve as servants and entertainers to the higher gods, the higher small g gods. And maybe they can hear your thoughts. Maybe Fred, maybe I'm just not understanding this question. I heard Gandhabba can smell and hear. What's your thoughts? And it's not that they hear what's your thoughts. That would be mind reading, which small g gods do have. They can read minds if they want to. Maybe not all of them, but a lot of them can. But now I'm starting to think that this question means, I heard Gandhabba can smell and hear, semicolon, what's your thoughts? And so he's probably not even referring to the small g gods one level above the human level, because Gandhabba also can mean a being ready for rebirth. It's like there's in Theravada Buddhism, they're talking about the requisites for conception. Like you have to have the man and the woman coming together. There has to be the moisture or the seed coming together, and there has to be the Gandhabba, which is like the karmic momentum of the being who is going to be born as this person. And so maybe Fred is asking if this karmic momentum of this being called a Gandhabba, who is going to manifest as the baby, who's going to enter the fertilized egg at conception, that they can smell and hear. So it's sort of like, maybe he's even asking if a zygote, a fertilized egg, can smell and hear. It may be that they have memories of smelling and hearing, but they wouldn't have a nose yet. They wouldn't have ears yet. Unless he's thinking of like this being, sort of like a homunculus who enters into the fertilized egg. This is kind of a confusing question for being a relatively short one. It may be that before they merge into the zygote, but then the way Abhidhamma explains things is that you can't have, or Abhidhamma doesn't explain the way rebirth works the way a lot of like Hindus explain it. There's like an instantaneous, from one, like the moment you die, the very next moment, like a trillionth of a second later, you have to enter into some other existence. So it may be just right the moment after a person dies, their consciousness stops, They're just boom, right back into an egg being fertilized. But I mean, you can't have intermediate states. You know, like the Bardo realms talked about by the Tibetans. You know, it's like 49 days or something, which would be sort of as sort of a spirit being. I mean, that's possible. I mean, you could still fit that into the system. It'd just be the next moment you're this temporary spirit being, and then you find the appropriate egg or zygote, you know, the appropriate mother and father getting it on. Let's see. So whether they can smell and hear, I mean, if they're this kind of being, not just, you know, the person dies the very next moment, it's, you know, egg fertilization time, probably then there wouldn't be much smelling and hearing going on. But I mean, if there is like this spirit being who is like the gandhabba, you know, like the literal gandhabba, the heavenly musician, the fairy being or whatever, yeah, I assume they can smell and hear up until they merge into the embryo, you know, become part of the embryo, and then it's just they're concerned with multiplying cells and growing organs and so forth. I think I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And Rui says, hello, Panyo. Is a doctrine of emptiness possible without an accompanying doctrine of two truths? So, the doctrine of emptiness, yeah, we're kind of getting into Majjhimaka realm here. Maybe I should put on the Majjhimaka fez. Just a second. Majjhimaka is so profound, you gotta wear the fez. Okay. So, is a doctrine of emptiness possible without an accompanying doctrine of two truths? Well, I guess we have to do a little defining of terms here. Emptiness, it doesn't mean nothingness. Emptiness is like abhyakada in Pali. It means indeterminate. I mean, it's just off the scale. You can't describe it with words, because in order to describe something in words, you've got to reify it into this thing or entity, and emptiness is not a thing or an entity. I might get into this a little later. There's somebody else talking about this a little lower down here on the list. So, the two truths are ultimate truth, in Pali, Paramatta Satcha, and conventional truth, or Samuti Satcha. So Samuti Satcha, conventional truth, is 2 and 2 is 4. I'm sitting here wearing a fez, drinking sweet tea. Carson City's the capital of Nevada. Epstein didn't kill himself. That kind of thing. Whereas ultimate truth is beyond words. You know, it's like the Kantian thing in itself. You cannot use words to describe it. You know, Kant also had two truths. He had the thing as it seems and the thing as it really is. And all we can really deal with is the thing as it seems, because dealing, just by its very nature, is one of the things as it seems, and it just cannot reach over this unbridgeable gulf into ultimate reality. So long as you're thinking in symbols, you can't touch ultimate reality, even though we're just wallowing in it all the time, because how far away can ultimate reality be? So, with that as a preamble, is a doctrine of emptiness possible without an accompanying doctrine of two truths? I think some of the radical Majjhimaka Buddhists really did do away with the two truths, where even emptiness itself is, you can't really call it a truth. I mean, it was, some of the early Majjhimaka Buddhists were so radical, you know, they couldn't call emptiness anything. You know, they just had to leave it alone. You know, you just argue every argument to death, and then just kind of step back and leave the emptiness behind, or in front of you, or whatever. I guess if you're stepping back, it'd be in front of you. So, yeah, I mean, you could have, theoretically, just do away with any truths at all. But then the doctrine of emptiness itself is still there, so that kind of kicks that idea in the head. But, I mean, you could just say that conventional truth isn't really true at all, and then just stick with that, and then you just have the one truth of ultimate truth. And I could live with that. I could see that as a valid way of arguing things. So, I mean, theoretically, some Majjhimaka Buddhists even came up with like 3 truths, where it was like, you've got ultimate truth, with the unspeakable. The the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. They got that highest truth, and then below they got the conventional truth of Carson City is the capital of Nevada and all that, and then in between they've got sort of like what Kant was doing with his categories. It's like, the structure of delusion, the structure of how we come up with these conventional truths is sort of like a higher truth. It's still not ultimate truth, but it's sort of in between. Sort of like in Theravada Buddhism, you've got ultimate truth, and then you sort of got Abhidhamma truth. Sorry about that. You got like the Abhidhamma explanation of reality, and then you've got, Carson City is the capital of Nevada, or, Savatthi is the capital of, what, Magadha? Yeah, Magadha. That sort of thing. So, yeah, it's not necessary that you have to have the doctrine of two truths with a doctrine of emptiness. So I'll take the fez off now. God, it's a good fez. It's really a nice fez. So the next question is from Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana, and he's being very subtle in his question asking this time. And so his first question is, I thought right view was realizing the Four Noble Truths directly, which would make all Buddhists, as far as I know, technically able to have this right view. Is this correct, or does right view also encompass other things? It can encompass other things, like a belief in karma, the belief that you have like moral obligation to look after your parents, that sort of thing. That's mentioned in like the stock lists with regard to right view in the texts. So there are other things, and right view, it's adjustable. Like when you're a beginner, you just have like this crude map, of this is the direction I have to go because of this and this reason. I have to know how to meditate and why to meditate, and there's a certain amount of like foundation to that, like the belief in karma and the Four Noble Truths and that sort of a thing. But then as you get more sophisticated in your practice, your right view is going to become more sophisticated. So most Buddhists, at least most Orthodox or non-heretical Buddhists who know anything about Buddhism, they can have like the simple beginning right view. But to really penetrate intuitively the Four Noble Truths, you'd have to be enlightened for that, or one moment before enlightenment. So I think I'll just gosh, I answered it so quickly. I'm kind of embarrassed, it's like maybe I should have spent another 10 minutes rambling about this one. Let's see. Does right view also encompass other things? I think I answered that. And this next question is kind of similar, so I'll just move on to Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana's next question here. And he says, I remember you talking about how being enlightened doesn't necessarily mean you will be a saint. Yeah, I have heard that a stream enterer, after glimpsing Nibbana, is able to enter Nibbana many times after doing it once and still not reach a higher level of sainthood. What do you think about Buddhism disregarding being able to enter Nibbana as the ultimate achievement and instead focuses more on the destruction of craving and the end of suffering? Well, the destruction of craving and the end of suffering technically is Nibbana, at least according to the Orthodox tradition. And with regard to a Sotapanna being able to access Nibbana, I don't think that is an original teaching of the Buddha. The whole 4 stages of sainthood, Sotapanna, Sakadagami, Anagami, Arahant, I do think is a later artifact. So let's see. Yeah, according to the texts, once you become an Arya, then you can get these flashes of Nibbana, but they don't stay. And even a fully enlightened being, like the Buddha himself, he's not in Nibbana all the time. And I just can't buy it. I just don't think so. I think if you're fully enlightened, you are, you've always got Nibbana there. You're aware of ultimate reality at all times. So, let's see. What do I think about Buddhism disregarding being able to enter Nibbana as the ultimate achievement, and instead focuses more on the destruction of craving and the ending of suffering? Yeah, I mean, entering Nibbana as the ultimate achievement, Co Vakshin Sipat Zidana here seems to be referring to Nibbana as like a metaphysical state and not an ethical state. Because Nibbana as an ethical state is essentially the destruction of craving and the end of suffering. The end of delusion also, I suppose. I mean, there's all these, equally valid, invalid ways of describing Nibbana that can sort of help you to at least feel kind of secure when thinking about it. But I mean, no definition is really going to touch it because, as I say, anything that's symbolic cannot touch ultimate reality. So, what do I think about Buddhism disregarding being? Yeah, I think part of that is just an artifact of later Theravadan Orthodox philosophy that I really don't think it works that way. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here, also from Co Vakshin Sipad Zidana. In the suttas, the Buddha's cousin Devadata was able to perform many psychic powers, yet gained no wisdom and ended up going to the lowest hell realms. If someone like that could master psychic powers, why do you think we never see someone like that today use psychic powers to attain fame and power? They could certainly prove every materialist wrong immediately if they were flying around and being in multiple places at once for their own gain. And then there was somebody responded to this under the YouTube video that was saying, yeah, they were essentially saying, yeah, that's good evidence that psychic powers just don't exist at all. It's just make-believe or superstition or something. But first of all, Devadatta was able to perform many psychic powers yet gained no wisdom. And he gained wisdom. It just wasn't sufficient. He was sort of like this amoral wisdom. So, I mean, he got wisdom, but it was amoral. I mean, he mastered jhana, which is very difficult to do. Most people can't do that. It wasn't just, he was just this evil. I mean, he's like, this ancient, Hunter Biden, let's say, and just was able to do these psychic powers. So, he did cultivate wisdom. You have to have purity of sila in order to have enough purity of mind that you can master jhana. So it was just that it just wasn't sufficient to get him enlightened or something. It was like this amoral kind of wisdom, and then he sort of fell back from it. He backslid. So let's see. Yeah, he supposedly, according to the legend, he tried to murder the Buddha and went to hell for it. Let's see, if someone like that could master psychic powers, why do you think we never see someone like that today use psychic powers to attain fame and power? Well, if they desire fame and power, they lack the wisdom to really master that sort of thing, for starters. Devadatta's motives were different. I mean, despite the evil motives projected onto him in the texts, I'm fairly skeptical that he even tried to murder the Buddha. I mean, this is all legends. So they could certainly prove every materialist wrong immediately if they were flying around and being in multiple places at once for their own gain. Well, I mean, if they're doing it for their own gain, they lack the wisdom for that sort of thing. The real masters of psychic powers still are people who have mastered meditation, and as a general rule, you master meditation through dedicating your life to it. As even Devadatta was doing that. I mean, he was diligently meditating out in forests and so forth, and renounced the world essentially. And Neem Karoli Baba, whose picture is up there, I mean, he did this sort of thing also. I mean, he wasn't just doing like magic shows all the time, but I mean, he had a lot of disciples who were firsthand witnesses to some just really just impossible stuff that he was doing, including Ram Dass. So the thing is, they could certainly prove every materialist wrong immediately if they were flying around. The thing is, people have to believe in this stuff. It reminds me of the story of Jesus in the New Testament, where he was able to do miracles. At the very least, he was able to heal the sick and so forth. Then he goes back to his hometown of Nazareth. And the people in his hometown of Nazareth are saying, hey, isn't that Jesus, the carpenter's son? I mean, don't his brothers and sisters live here in town? I mean, who does he think he is? And because they lacked faith in him, he wasn't able to do very many miracles. He healed a few sick people, maybe just, asthma or cases of sniffles or something, and, cast out maybe a wimpy demon or two, and then just went somewhere else because people didn't believe in him. And even when he would heal somebody, he would say, it's your own faith that healed you. And so, I mean, there has to be an acceptance of the possibility of this in order for it to happen. And when you're living in a spiritually bankrupt, materialistic version of reality, just a materialistic culture where people firmly believe you can't do that, then it's way less likely to happen. So I think that's part of the problem, is that people just firmly believe that it's bullshit, and that it makes it way less possible for it to happen. You'd have to have a really advanced master in front of relatively few people who can overcome that resistance from spiritually bankrupt normies. And I hope I haven't just insulted the people that were saying that psychic powers don't exist. In fact, I mean, parapsychology is one of the most carefully designed, it has some of the most carefully designed experiments of any branch of science. And they have demonstrated, I mean, they have really demonstrated, as well as you can demonstrate anything, that there is, like, the average person has some psychic ability. It might be a fraction of 1%. Let's say they're guessing cards or coin flips or something, just a fraction of 1% above random chance. But when you're doing it thousands of times, that fraction of a percent becomes statistically significant. And some people do way better than a fraction of 1%. So I think we're just living in a spiritually bankrupt, a spiritually comatose age, in a spiritually comatose culture that relies on science and technology for its magic. But if the science and technology are not there, the magic is going to manifest in other ways. We just have this way that can be sort of logically, rationally understood, and we insist upon our magic, for the most part, fitting into that. And so we fly in the air and talk to people thousands of miles away and so forth, but we do it through science and technology. But if the science and technology were not there, there'd be other ways for these abilities to manifest. And it might just be like really advanced people who are like cultivating themselves for years and years wholeheartedly to develop these abilities. But I do think that it does happen from time to time. So I'll just move on to Siovak and Sipat Zidana's next question here. When we look at how religions were in India in the Buddhist time, they seem like the philosophical schools of ancient Greek persuasion in many ways, along with their practices. Buddhists, skeptics, atomists, materialists, annihilationists, fatalists, etc. Even the Brahmins believed in understanding the true nature of the self as the ultimate good. However, when we see all the modern Indian religions, they have all devolved to various kinds of devotionalism, whether it is some cosmic Buddha in Mahayana, the Hindu worshipping Vishnu or Shiva, or whatever the local deity is, or even in Theravada Buddhism, making some convoluted story about how the Buddha will see you praying with his omniscience by looking into the future. Even the supposed enlightened Hindus today are mostly just going on about devotionalistic practices. Why do you think the Indian religions in general lost most of their intellectual sophistication? Even though I know you said that the Pali texts were written before logic was really developed, the ideas in it still seem leagues and bounds more sophisticated than what most of these Indian gurus preach today, whether it was the Buddhist ideas or the ideas of their rival schools. Well, that's an interesting question. I don't think anyone's asked that one before, although it's a valid question. So, I mean, there still are some philosophical schools in India. It's like Advaita Vedanta, for example, which is comparable to what was going on in the Buddhist time. But it is true that Hinduism, I mean, you had like Vedic Brahmanism Vedism, I guess, which eventually evolved into modern Hinduism. And I think a large part of that was as Indian philosophy and religion, as we know it, spread farther south, it was spreading down into a different ethnicity with different culture. It was like largely, Indo-Europeans and like the descendants of the Indus Valley civilization, for example, living in the north. In the south, you had like Tamils, you had Dravidians mostly. I mean, there's lots of Dravidians in the north too, but they weren't dominating the culture in the north the way they were in the south. And I think the Dravidians were way more passionate and emotional and devotionalistic in their approach. So it was like when Hinduism or proto-Hinduism, when Indian philosophy and religion spread into southern India, it became more and more devotionalistic, which then kind of went back into the north and influenced the north. But I mean, it's a relatively modern thing, and there's like medieval India was still very philosophical. You had all these Buddhist sects and Hindus or proto-Hindu sects, maybe still then, debating each other. And maybe now it's all been subsumed into this one Hinduism that is very easygoing with regard to different beliefs, that maybe they don't have this rigorous debate, sharpening everybody all the time also. So I think part of it is just the effect of southern India on northern India. And also, I do think it may be that there's less diversity, partly just through, survival of the fittest or whatever. The Buddhists all got wiped out by the Muslims. And Hinduism sort of closed ranks or something. They're not so much inclined to debate with each other anymore. So, yeah, I think that's part of it too. And as I say, we're just in a less spiritually advanced age than we were back then. It's strange. It's like we're living in an age of like spiritual mediocrity. Whereas in the Buddhist time, you had more enlightened beings. You also had more cannibals and mass murderers and so forth. So you had a broader spectrum of the highest and the lowest, and now we're living in just this state of spiritual mediocrity. So, and that would apply to India also. Maybe not quite as much as in the West, but I mean the West has pervasive effects on the entire world now. So that would be, I mean, it's just sort of educated guesses. So I think I have read before, some scholar was saying that the devotionalist and just emotionalism of southern India did like significantly affect India after the northern religious systems spread, just Indian culture as known today spread into southern India. So I think I'll content myself with that sort of sketchy explanation and move on to Nirmit's question here. And I talked about this a few shows back, I think. Nirmit says, is it possible that Mahavira and the Buddha were the same person? I am asking this because if you recall their life stories, they have so many similarities. And Mahavira was reputedly the founder of Jainism, or like the latest founder of Jainism, because they believe in Tirthankaras, sort of like, fully enlightened Jains, like a long lineage of them, with Mahavira being the latest one, I think. They might have come up with later ones. I'm really not keeping up on my Jainism lately. Sort of like in Buddhism, there's like a series of Buddhas. So they had that idea. But even in ancient, like in the Pali texts, Mahavira and the Buddha were contemporaries. They met and spoke to each other. Mahavira is called Niganta Nataputa. The Jains were called Nigantas, which means without bonds or without ties. And Nataputa, I'm pretty sure, is like a joke name. It's sort of like a propagandist name, which means something like son of grandson. And I'm pretty sure that Mahavira, he really existed. But the thing is, like I explained before, that the Jains were much more ascetic than the Buddhists. The Jains were much more likely to just own nothing and wander around, some of them wandering around naked, You know, in the cold season, when it gets like freezing cold, you could actually die of hypothermia. They just smear themselves with mud as a kind of insulation. And they had way fewer scholars. And so what happened was you had insufficient numbers of Jain monks memorizing the text, because texts weren't written down in India in those days. Whereas the Buddhists, you know, they were more scholarly Buddhists that weren't so much into the asceticism thing, so they would just memorize texts and chant texts and, you know, teach it to others and so forth. Whereas the Jains were much less likely to do that, and so twice in their history they lost their texts, and so they had to have like emergency convocations to come together and salvage as much information from their lost texts, because the people that had memorized them had died out and no new ones had shown up. You know, they just had to get bits and pieces and fill in the blanks and so forth. And I think one of the blanks they filled in was Mahavira's biography, because they pretty obviously took that from the Buddha's, you know, legendary biography. You know, he was of the Kshatriya caste, and he was, you know, a prince, and, you know, renounced the world in a dramatic way. Although he didn't shave his head and beard, Mahavira didn't. He just pulled them out, and I think it was like 5 handfuls, which must have hurt. And you know, they went through all the asceticism stuff. It was very similar. And either Mahavira's legendary biography is copied from the Buddhist, you know, the Gautama Buddha's legendary biography, or I mean, it's also theoretically possible that they're both copying from an earlier source. Although I would guess that because the Jains lost their body of texts twice, and just had to salvage what they could and fill in the blanks as best they could, that they just copied the life story of Gautama Buddha with regard to his younger years before the Great Renunciation and before his enlightenment. But I mean, Mahavira is mentioned in the text. Apparently, I mean, he was a contemporary of the Buddha. He was older than the Buddha, but they both lived at the same time. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Saint Sword, or Saint's Word. I still haven't figured that one out. And this, I mean, I don't know if he did this. He was the one who did this last time, but he gave this really long kind of commentary to my answer to his question or questions. And there is actually a question at the end here. There is a question mark to this, but it's going in a different direction. But I would just kind of like to address this, just because, you know, it is a long comment with regard to a question and an answer under a Q&A video. So I'm doing it. It's my show. I can do it if I want to. So Saint Sword, or Saint's Word, says, okay, responding to your response to my emptiness nothingness discussion, I'm trying to understand Nibbana with all of this. Danger, danger. I suspect Nibbana is something far more profound than nothingness. The first 3 arupa jhanas do involve perception of one of the qualities of nothingness. You are perceiving either infinite space, infinite consciousness, or infinite nothingness. What I mean is that perception is not active only when you get to neither perception or non-perception and nirodha samapati. I'm leaving anidasana vijnana and nibbana alone for a minute, since there's so many questions there. So I think to say that making nothingness into an object means it's not nothingness anymore is incorrect. You're perceiving nothingness in these states, and perception is always intentional toward an object, just a very subtle one in this case. Another approach is to note that vijnana, the aggregate, is still active in all the arupa jhanas, and according to Digha Nikaya 15, vijnana and namarupa are codependent. Therefore, in these arupa jhanas, vijnana and namarupa must both be active if vijnana is active. Since these are the arupa jhanas, clearly rupa is not active, therefore nama must be active. What nama is active? Question mark. Oh, another question mark. What nama is active? The mental object of, rhetorical question. The mental object of nothingness. There's no other choice. So there's no separation between the idea of nothingness and nothingness itself. In this case, that nothingness is still nama. The idea of nothingness, as you're referring to it, is like the set that only contains 0, but the actual rupa jhana is like the empty set. But in either case, they're still an idea or set, and therefore objects. Only with Nibbana and Nirodha Samapatti is Vijnana not active. Nibbana is the blowing out of Vijnana, the blowing out of the set entirely. It's not the empty set. Okay, this is really long again, my apologies. It's an interesting discussion to me. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand some experiences I had many years ago. Don't worry about me thinking about this too much. I also meditate 3 hours a day, LOL, so I got the practice going on too. And then before he gets to the actual question, I would just like to comment on this a little bit. So, let's see. I suspect Nibbana is something far more profound than nothingness. I agree. I do not consider Nibbana to be zero or just annihilation. So the first three Arupa jhanas, this is him reading, this is him saying this again. The first three Arupa jhanas do involve perception of one of the qualities of nothingness. Well, I mean, this is already getting weird because nothingness should have no qualities. See, it's like to attribute qualities to something, you have to have a something. And by definition, nothingness is not a something. I mean, it's not an object, because to have an object, there has to be something there to be the object, and nothingness doesn't exist, or at least real, true nothingness. It doesn't exist. You know, it's not a thing. It's not an object. It's not a state. Because you can call it a state and think about it as a state, but then it's just a perception. It's this mental construct of nothingness, which isn't really nothingness. So you are perceiving either infinite space, and nothingness really, I mean you could call it infinite space, but then the space, you're perceiving it as a something. See, you're reifying emptiness, and by reifying emptiness, it's not emptiness anymore. So infinite consciousness, obviously by definition, that wouldn't be nothing, or infinite nothingness. What I mean is that perception is not active only when you get to neither perception nor non-perception. Well, neither perception nor non-perception is as high as mentality can go, because it's right at the verge of perception. So you can't say that there's no perception. See, right here, what I mean is that perception is not active only when you get to neither perception or non-perception. Well, by the very name of this state, it's not saying that perception is not active, because it's neither perception nor non-perception. So it's just this so subtle that you can't put your finger on it. So maybe Nirodha Samapatti, which is, it's a state of suspended animation, like beyond a hibernating squirrel, which doesn't go back to the earliest texts. See, all right, so I think that by making, so he says here, so I think to say that making nothingness into an object means it's not nothingness anymore is incorrect. But yeah, I mean, I don't understand. It seems like Saint Sword here is just stuck in his thoughts, that he can't differentiate like the perception of a thing with the thing itself. I mean, that's it's the way it seems to me. Because nothingness can't be an object, because an object has to be an it, and nothingness by definition isn't an it. There's no it there. There's nothing there. If you turn the nothingness itself into an it, what you've got is an idea. You've got an idea of nothingness. You cannot perceive nothingness, because it would just be empty perception. And maybe Saint Sword is saying you can have an empty perception, but there has to be a perception of something. And if you turn nothingness into a something, it's not nothingness anymore. It's a something now. So I think there's different kinds of nothing. And this might be the part of the sticking points. It's just as there's different kinds of infinity. Like the number of integers is infinite, right? The number of even integers is also infinite, although, intuitively you would assume that there's twice as many integers as just even integers, because there'd be an equal amount of odd integers, but still somehow they're both infinite. Or you take a Euclidean plane, it's infinite. you cut it in half. The area of that half plane is still infinite, even though it's obviously half of what you started with. And the 0 is the same way. I mean, it's like you got the number 0, which just represents, it's an integer. Oh, it's a whole number. So, there's just different kinds of infinity, which, absolute infinity would just be pure being. And then there'd be like different kinds of nothing or 0, but the ultimate, just absolute nothing, would just be pure non-being. And as Hegel says at the beginning of his logic, they just merge into each other and are indistinguishable. So, okay, here. Arupa jhana here is referring to formless meditations. So, according to, another approach to note that vijnana, the aggregate, is still active in all the arupa jhanas. Yeah, and according to orthodox Theravada like Abhidhamma, you can't have the aggregate of consciousness without perception. There has to be some kind of perception. Even the realm of neither perception nor non-perception, the perception is just so subtle you can't say it's there and you can't say it's not there either. So it's getting into the paradoxical realm, because once you get to infinity, it's just paradox. So let's see. Okay. Yeah, nama is active. What nama is active? The mental object of nothingness. Well, it's a mental object, but it's not the actual nothingness. Yeah, that's where we're disagreeing, I guess. So he says, so there's no separation between the idea of nothingness and nothingness itself in this case. But no, I'd say it is just like this radical, just quantum difference between any idea of anything and the actual reality. It's like Kant again. The thing as it really is, the thing in itself, has this unbridgeable gulf to perception, because perception is symbolic. It's just turning a symbol, like an arbitrary symbol, in maybe all cases, and just saying, like there's some tree out there. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, there's a tree in ultimate reality, and the thing in itself of that tree. But any idea we have about that tree is going to be just infinitely different from the tree as it really is. Because they just cannot touch each other. The Kantian thing as it seems is never going to even approach the Kantian thing as it really is, the thing in itself. So, I guess, well, he can continue to disagree or whatever. That's fine. I'm not insisting only this is true, anything else is wrong. Because only fools do that. So, Nibbana is the blowing out of vijnana. So, I'm not exactly sure that that's necessarily the case either. Nibbana would be the blowing out of mentality. It'd be possibly the blowing out of mental states, or at least the rendering of mental states as irrelevant, because they are no longer like the object. They're no longer perceived as mental states. But, I might have to put the fez back on to get any farther with that. So I think I'll just move on to St. Sword's actual question here, not the rhetorical one. And that is, by the way, have you ever heard of Bernadette Roberts? She's a former Carmelite nun who I suspect was a full arahant. She died just a few years ago. The Experience of No Self is probably her most famous book, and this is an easy question to answer because I do not recall ever having heard of Bernadette Roberts. So, yeah, I would not be completely flabbergasted if a Carmelite nun was fully enlightened. So, they are a contemplative sect. She probably meditated a lot. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here. And this is from Edelweiss Voyager. And Edelweiss Voyager says, do you feel that Pure Land Buddhism should be completely shunned, or is it acceptable to pray to the mythological Buddhas, he says, if one is able to do so in a non-spiritually materialist way? I understand that this is not an orthodox teaching of Shakyamuni Buddha, but I feel like if His Holiness was teaching to a 21st century rationalist post-enlightenment Anglo-Saxon audience, his teachings may have been different. You sound frustrated every time you talk about Pure Land, and don't feel pressured to answer this if you do not want to. Well, I mean, it is true, I think. It's likely, let's say, that if Gautama Buddha were alive today, he'd be teaching things differently. Like, he wouldn't be going with ancient Indian cosmology, probably, ancient Indian just tradition, that he'd be going with whatever tradition he happened to be in, because, the outward form of a Buddha is still going to be a product of his culture. So nevertheless, I mean, let's see right here. If His Holiness was teaching to a 21st century rationalist post-enlightenment Anglo-Saxon audience, he's still not going to be teaching mythological Buddhas. I mean, it's like, don't pay attention to me, don't let me help you get enlightened. Pray to this other Buddha who is in this other dimension or this other world, and pray to be born. And I mean, just ignore what I'm telling you about how you shouldn't try to get enlightened in this life. Instead, pray to this mythological, or this Buddha you can't see, even though I'm standing here right in front of you. Don't pay attention to that. Pray to this other one that you can't see, just assuming that he's real enough that you can be reborn into his pure land, and then he'll help you get enlightened. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. Not to me, anyway. So, Pure Land Buddhism, I mean, it shouldn't be completely shunned. I mean, you can study it for anthropological purposes. You want to see the weird directions that Buddhism has evolved. And from what I've seen, Pure Land Buddhism still has some genuine, morality to it. So that's good. But, I mean, why pray to a mythological Buddha it seems to me that they were just made up. I mean, maybe they're egregores, like we were talking about earlier. I mean, that would be your best bet, that Amitabha Buddha has been believed in so much by so many people that he is now kind of existing as an egregore. But a genuine Buddha, you can't even say whether they exist or not, whether, even if they're standing there in front of you. So, yeah, I really don't think that it would be in a Buddhist person's best interests to sideline the actual historical Buddha in favor of mythological ones that nobody had ever heard of until hundreds of years after the death of Gautama Buddha. So I'm kind of surprised that he says I seem frustrated every time I talk about Pure Land. But yeah, I guess I did get kind of worked up on that one. But to me, yeah, it is true. I mean, I consider Pure Land Buddhism to be like a grotesque aberration from genuine Dhamma in many respects, not all respects. I mean, in some respects, it's essentially the opposite of what the Buddha was teaching. So in that case, if you really want to follow what the Buddha taught, not some, cosmic Buddha in some other dimension, but, like the Buddha that was born on this planet, then, yeah, you'd do better to study the oldest texts and try to find, as much authentic material as you can and follow that. I mean, it's just like a rational, empirical audience of 21st century Anglo-Saxons. I mean, they're obviously going to want something more objective than, pure legend with no actual facts backing it up other than people's convictions. Because, I mean, the Jehovah's Witnesses have convictions too. But just because they believe something doesn't mean that's necessarily true, unless Jehovah's an egregore. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is also from Edelweiss Voyager. So Edelweiss Voyager's last question. In fact, he says here, this is my last question. I have recently seen anatta translated as not self rather than no self. This translation is used to argue for the existence of a permanent soul. It seems like people who follow this translation, Wikipedia gives the example of Richard Gombrich and Alexander Wynne, are just not capable of understanding codependent origination. I do, however, think that allowing this minor mistranslation to spread would be helpful in spreading Buddhism to normies and Nietzscheans. What are your thoughts on this? Thank you so much for taking the time to answer all of our questions. Well, he seems to be asking if we can just get rid of the anatta stuff of no self and say, well, there is a self. It's just that the five khandas are not our self, that we have this soul, this immortal soul that might serve Buddhism in some way, although in a way it's perverting Dhamma. It's misrepresenting the Buddha, in my opinion. And Ajahn Thanissaro, who is quite orthodox in most respects as far as I know, he also prefers, I think it's not self to no self, in that, he also goes with the idea of the five aggregates are not self, but kind of leaving the door open to maybe something else that is self, although the texts do claim that the five aggregates are essentially the cosmos. So, yeah, I don't think that you should deliberately misrepresent the Buddha in order to get more converts. People who have little dust in their eyes are always going to form a small minority. And if you get Buddhism, sort of like what happened with Christianity, or to some degree Buddhism in the East, where you get everybody a Buddhist, you're going to have lots and lots of fools and just bad people and just stupid people. Nothing wrong with being simple, but still you're going to have just like raging fools as Buddhists, and there's always going to be a certain amount of raging fools as Buddhists, but you don't want to just invite everybody in. So yeah, Richard Gombrich, he had some weird ideas. He was saying that just metta meditation can get you enlightened and so forth. I do think he was not a Buddhist, I'm pretty sure, and I do think that he was like this Oxbridge academic type who really, he was just, if you're an Oxbridge academic type, or at least in his generation, you're going to have lots of Church of England in you, or some kind of Christianity. You're going to have a Christian wife probably, and they're going to be very much influenced by their own cultural conditioning, because an Oxbridge academic has little choice but to consider his cultural conditioning to be the best. It just seems to be my experience. Or if not his cultural conditioning are the best, then his judgment is the best. Because I guess Ajahn Brahm is an Oxbridge graduate, and to some degree he's kind of following his cultural conditioning, but as an ordained monk, is not as much as Gombrich. And Gombrich, I should say, I think he was an Oxford professor of Buddhist studies. He was a professor of Sanskrit, and also he was president of the Polytech Society for a while. So, yeah, I don't think you should try to deliberately distort Buddhism in order to get more converts. That just kills a religion. Look what's happening with Protestant Christianity now, or even Catholicism with their rainbow pope. So, yeah, you're better off just letting it be a relatively exclusive group of, like a minority movement. So long as it's allowed, so long as it's not like persecuted or something. So I'll just move on to the next question here. And this is from Nathan. I'm going to check the time here. Wow, this is going fast. It's only been an hour and a half. So this question from Nathan. And Nathan says, if we have been in samsara for an infinite period of time, then how have we not become enlightened yet? The only explanation I can think of for this dilemma is that perhaps enlightenment itself is the only event which is beyond the infinite samsaric experiences we've been undergoing since beginningless time. But if this were the case, then enlightenment itself would be seemingly beyond causation, which might violate paticca samuppada ? Well, this is a problem, not only for Theravada, it's an even bigger problem for Mahayana, because Mahayana Buddhists take bodhisattva vows, where they vow to save all beings before they become enlightened or allow themselves to enter, final Nibbana. And I mean, the universe has been here for an infinite amount of time already. So there's already been an infinite amount of time elapsed, and we still have apparently an infinite number of unenlightened suffering beings, which would seem to indicate logically there's always going to be an infinite number of suffering beings. And there's different ways of accounting for this. I mean, one account is that in an infinite universe, anything that can happen does happen. And it's like my theory of everything is the uncarved block, where you've got this, what's the word? Having a block. That's kind of a joke there. This like an analogy. Okay, an analogy. You've got this block of stone, and inside this block of stone, and it doesn't have anything around it to compare it with, so the size is, just consider it sizeless, because you got nothing to compare it with anyway. So you got this block of stone, and inside that block of stone is contained every possible statue. I mean, every single molecule of every bit of that statue is already there. You just got to dismiss the extraneous rock. And there's every possible statue and an infinite number of impossible statues too. You've got Myron's discus thrower with legs as thin as hairs that couldn't really stand up on its own, but it's still in that block of stone. So if you think about samsara that way, I mean, when you become enlightened, you're just transcending all these imaginary potential statues that really are in there in a sense, but they're virtual, they're potential, but it's really there in a sense. So when you become enlightened, you just transcend all the statues, and you just merge with the block of stone as a whole. You've merged with infinity essentially. So in a case like that, there's always going to be an infinite number of suffering beings because they are possible. So if you reject that, that's fine. So let's just go with another hypothesis is that we haven't been here forever, that the universe is churning out new beings all the time. Sort of like it's creating new stars in a way. And one way that I've discussed the possibility of this before, there's a couple possibilities that I've read in this weird book called Seth Speaks. One is that the karmic momentum of an individual being can split, and then you've got two smaller beings. So I mean, that could be a way of like suffering beings reproducing themselves, sort of metaphysically in the karmic sense. And another one is that when you dream at night, or just in your imagination, you think about people that don't really exist, but like in your dream, you dream about some person, and they continue to, you've given birth to this being. They've got like this very shady, very ephemeral, sort of, even below ghost-like level of existence, but still they exist, and then they start their own trajectory, their own, evolution or series of births or whatever. And then another possibility is like what the Jains believe, and I think maybe some Hindus believe this also, is that that a being begins at this elemental level, like a crystal or something, and then you'd have like this simplest form of karmic existence that can form spontaneously, sort of like organic life had to form spontaneously somehow or other. So that's a possibility too. But yeah, it does seem pretty gloomy if you think that there are an infinite number of suffering beings supposedly, although according to Buddhism, none of them really exist. None of them is ultimately real, at least according to Theravada Buddhism. So that's one reason, or one thing you can think of, and I think I read this in a Mahayana text. It was the Sutra of Huineng, I think, where he says that when you become enlightened, you look around and you see that everybody else is enlightened too. So that would be good news for Mahayanists, sort of, in that the only way to liberate all beings is to become enlightened to the point that you realize that all these suffering beings don't really exist anyway. There's nobody to liberate. but I'm getting a little too metaphysical here. So it is something that he says here in this is, see, I can think of the only explanation I can think of for this dilemma is that perhaps enlightenment itself is the only event which is beyond the infinite samsaric experiences we've been undergoing since beginning this time. And some Mahayana Buddhism does teach this, that there is enlightenment, but there's no moment of enlightenment. There's nobody who becomes enlightened. The whole thing is a paradox, again. So enlightenment itself would seemingly be beyond causation. Well, Nibana is beyond causation. I mean, if Nibana had a cause, then it would be conditioned by that cause, and it would be impermanent and suffering. So, yeah, that's another thing. I mean, Nibbana has no cause. Because if it did have a cause, it would be a conditioned thing. It would be a sankhara. It would not be Nibbana. So, yeah, welcome to the Paradox Club. It's all paradoxical. Once you get into the realm of infinity or the absolute, I mean, you're just going to be wallowing in paradox unless you're just not sensitive to the existence of paradoxes. You just don't want to see them. So I'll just move on to Nathan's next question here. Do you think the Buddha actually taught the 5 aggregates as such? I've been skimming through G.C. Pandey's studies, thanks for the recommendation, and he is convinced that the Khandas were a later development. However, Pandey further argues that the Buddha originally taught a simpler schematic of kaya and vijnana, with vijnana as the atta. This seems to betray his Hindu conditioning more than anything, but I agree with him that the 5 khandas feel a bit questionable. If I had to make a guess, I'd say the recursive interrelation of namarupa and vijnana, such as in the Mahanidana Sutta, is probably closer to how the Buddha actually talked about subjective human experiences, but who knows. G.C. Pandey, who wrote Studies in the Origins of Buddhism, he was a Hindu, and he did have sort of a Hindu take on Buddhism. I mean, his book is well worth reading. It's really good, but you have to sort of bear in mind that he is going to be leaning towards like a Vedantist interpretation of Buddhism. But I guess I should, for those of you who are sort of beginners, I guess I should define some of these terms. He's using a lot of Pali in here. The khandas are the aggregates. They're the 5 aggregates of which a human being is composed according to orthodox Theravada Buddhist philosophy. And it's Rupa Khanda, or the aggregate of form. Then you've got Vedana Khanda, or the aggregate of feeling or feelings. You've got Sanya Khanda, the aggregate of perception. You've got Sankhara Khanda, the aggregate of karma formations, which mainly means chetana or volition. And then you've got Vijnana Khanda is the aggregate of consciousness, and that is what a human being is composed of. And kaya means body, Vijnana is consciousness, and it says here that the Buddha originally taught a simpler schematic of kaya and Vijnana, with Vijnana as the atta, and atta means self. But if I recall, it seems like he was talking about just mind and body. That the Buddha, or G.C. Pandey was saying that in the oldest texts, or what appear to be the oldest texts, the Buddha isn't talking about the 5 khandas or the 5 aggregates. He's just talking about, like mind and body. So, I mean, none of that would be the self. So let's see here. Yeah, I mean, especially if you consider the orthodox development of the 5 khandas, like according to Abhidhamma and the commentarial system, you've got Rupa Khanda, that's physical matter, the body itself, and then you've got 52 mental states. See, all right, you've got Rupa is ultimately real, consciousness or mind is ultimately real, and then you've got 52 ultimately real mental states, with Vedana Khanda being one of those 52, Sanya Khanda as being another one of those 52, and the remaining 50 are all lumped together in Sankhara Khanda, which is like not good logic, it's not good system, and personally I'm rather skeptical of it. I think the older method of just saying that Sankhara Khanda is volition or cetana or will is better, and you just get rid of the extra 49 mental states, which includes things like wrong view as an ultimately real mental state. I mean, I'm sorry that Abhidhamma even exists, to tell you the truth. I mean, you can get benefit from studying it just to become literate in what the Orthodox tradition asserts, but like Venerable Jnanavira, not the new famous Jnanavira, but the older famous Jnanavira who lived in Ceylon back in the 50s and 60s, he said the less Abhidhamma you know, the better, because the less you have to unlearn in order to really understand Dhamma. But I'm kind of skeptical that he really understood it either. So, let's see. Yeah, I'm kind of questionable about the whole 5 khandas going all the way back to the Buddha himself. So I would agree with G.C. Pandey on that. And so now I'll just move on to the next question. And this is from Chirzowix's. He had an easy name to pronounce, and I'm not pronouncing it correctly now, but at least I've settled on like a standardized pronunciation for this. And Chirzowix's says, according to the Pali Canon, did the Buddha ever make derogatory remarks about dark skin? Wait a minute. Okay, I got that wrong. That's wrong. He didn't ask that. Chirzowix's didn't ask that question. I'm going to type the right question because I remember this one. This is a weird question. Is your favorite species of crab? Okay, so Chirzowix's says, what is your favorite species of crab? And that's, I mean, I've told a story about a crab maybe in the last Q&A, and I believe it was a tanner crab of the genus Cyanocides, which in restaurants is called snow crab. But what is my favorite species of crab? I mean, that's weird. And I'm not exactly sure what he has in mind here. I mean, with regard to eating crab, I would guess maybe king crab, some kind of Alaskan king crab. And there's like 4 different species, at least, of Alaskan king crab. And unfortunately, I'm rusty in my Bering Sea marine biological taxonomy. And so I don't even remember the genus of king crabs. With regard to species of crab, the species of which I still recall, Cancer Magister is nice. It's the Dungeness crab of the Pacific coast. But with regard to crabs that I've been familiar with, that I struck up a friendship with, I used to have some pet hermit crabs, land hermit crabs. So I don't know, those are the ones that I had the most affection for, I guess. And one interesting point, while I'm mentioning crabs and king crabs and hermit crabs, it is apparent that the king crab of the Bering Sea, you know, the luxury food item that gets really big, that they are evolved from hermit crabs. And one of the reasons they know this is that if you pull open the flap, you know, a crab has got its, oh, I did it again. The computer is telling me that the battery's running out because I always forget to plug in this battery. Just a second. I forget to plug in the computer. It's not even funny. Okay. Where was I? Oh yeah. King crabs. Okay, so a crab is essentially like a shrimp, except its tail is folded up underneath it, and it's flat, and it keeps its eggs and so forth in there. And if you pull that flap out, you see that the little leglets that are inside there are asymmetrical. You know, they're bigger on one side than on the other side under the flap of a king crab, and they're asymmetrical because their ancestors were hermit crabs, and a hermit crab has to have asymmetrical little legs on the back of its body to hold it into a spirally curved snail shell. So because the snail shell is like in a spiral going this way, it has to have bigger legs on one side and smaller legs on the other side to hold it in there good. So that's enough of the marine biology lesson for today. And so Terzauix is I'm sorry, I really don't technically have a favorite species of crab. I mean, I could just be this weird personality quirk of mine that I do not have a favorite species of crab. So Terzauix's next question here is, do you have a bug out bag? And then in parentheses, he calls it an evacuation bag. And I have to admit, I am not a prepper. So there's this, my sweetheart watches this guy. He's a prepper in South Carolina, and I would not want to hang out with this guy because, I mean, he's just always on the lookout for threats to his family's survival. And like, you know, he does these videos how you get these concrete picnic benches. These are good because in the case of an emergency, you can tip the concrete picnic bench on its side and hide behind it with your rifle. You know, this kind of stuff. And it's, man, he would not be a fun person to hang out with because he's just like always like on yellow alert at least. So, I mean, my bug out bag would probably be a Glock and some clips of ammo. I don't know. I was a monk for so long. It's like, I mean, everything you own, supposedly, you should just be able to carry with you. You know, I'm just kind of a minimalist still. I just don't think in those terms, even though I now have a family to take care of. But I guess the easy answer for that, for Terzauix's question there, is no, I do not have a bug out bag. I mean, we don't even have extra water bottles stored in the basement or anything like that. So, I mean, when the shit hits the fan, don't attack our house and try and steal our survival stuff because we don't have any. That's the moral of that story. So I'll just move on to the next question here. And this is from Vegan Samurai. And Vegan Samurai says, have you ever heard of Yukio Mishima? He was a renowned Japanese author, playwright, poet, and actor. He is considered one of the most important Japanese authors of the 20th century and was nominated 3 times for the Nobel Prize in Literature. Mishima was also a prominent figure in Japanese society, known for his nationalist and traditionalist views, as well as his interest in bodybuilding and martial arts. In 1970, Mishima committed ritual suicide by seppuku, also known as harakiri, after leading a failed military coup in an attempt to restore power to the Japanese emperor. So the question here is, have I ever heard of Yukio Mishima? And maybe, I mean, I've heard of a lot of people, and then it just doesn't register sufficiently that I can say, oh yeah, I was riding a bus and somebody sitting next to me, he was wearing a tweed jacket and he was smoking a cigar and he was telling, no, I don't remember any of that. So maybe I've heard of him, but almost everything I know about Yukio Mishima is contained in this question. So sorry about that. I just got a notice on the computer. So finally, the very last question. And this is also from Vegan Samurai. Vegan Samurai asks, according to the Pali Canon, did the Buddha ever make derogatory remarks about dark skin? And I do not recall the Buddha ever making derogatory comments about dark skin, although there are kind of sort of derogatory comments about dark skin in the texts, simply because it was a cultural thing. For example, I think it was one of the 2 main kings in the Buddhist time, King Pasenadi or King Bimbisara. I can't remember which. I think, yeah, I don't remember which. But his favorite wife was dark-skinned, and it was considered sort of a joke or something. You know, sort of not exactly a scandal, but you know, he was very devoted to his wife who had dark skin, and so it was kind of an issue. And I don't remember if the Buddha was even talking about it much, but I mean, there is a rule in the rules of monastic discipline that you should not ordain a candidate for the monkhood if his skin is very dark, but you also are not supposed to ordain a candidate for monkhood if his skin is very light. And the reason for that is just if he stands out as being kind of weird looking, just like really standing out as just sort of something that people would be talking about at home after he walks by. You know, did you see that monk? Did you see how weird he looked? That kind of a thing. They were trying to avoid that sort of thing. So even a monk with a unibrow is not, like a person with a unibrow is not supposed to be ordained. So, I mean, there is that. But I think mainly you'd be likely to find in the Pali texts, not the Buddha making derogatory remarks about dark skin. I mean, the only person the Buddha would make derogatory remarks about would be a foolish person, regardless of skin color, regardless of what caste they were born in, any of that, regardless even of their religion. I mean, you know, he would call out Buddhist fools as quickly as he'd call out like Jain fools, for example. So the Buddha did not make derogatory comments about anybody other than just, you know, foolish people, including bad people. And he would just call them out. I mean, he wouldn't be making, you know, jokes about them or anything. But in ancient India, especially northern India, it was fair skin was an upper class kind of a thing. It still is. I mean, there's different reasons for it now. Back then, the upper class had fair skin partly because the upper classes had more Indo-Aryan ancestry, whereas the Aboriginal peoples that were already in India when the Indo-Aryans invaded were more dark-skinned, like South Indians. And so it was considered to be, you know, better to be fair-skinned in ancient India, in northern ancient India, because it showed more of a high-class ancestry. But also, and even nowadays in third world countries, if you have fair skin, that means you're not working out in the sun getting burnt and black every day. It means that you have high enough social status that you don't have to be a manual laborer out in the burning sun. So school teachers, educated people, shop owners, you know, they cultivate, you know, even like a pasty, you know, they just as light of skin as they can manage, because fair skin is like a status symbol. You know, it indicates social status. So some acknowledgement of that is probably to be found in the text, which is one reason why, you know, people were kind of making fun of the fact that this king's favorite wife had dark skin. You know, it's just acknowledging what was going on in the culture at the time, but there's no promotion of derogatory remarks about dark skin. Not that I can think of. And the Buddha would not be bad-mouthing anybody other than people that were considered to be fools. So that's the last question. And so, by golly, we are done. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments below. If you have access to my Subscribe Star, you can ask them there. If you have access to the Discord server, you can ask them there. And feel free to like and subscribe if you haven't already. And look at the URL links below. And be happy. Hi, it's me again. I did the whole Q&A, and then I did 2 videos with Brian Rue, and then I realized that I forgot to answer a question. So I'm back again to answer the one more question. And this is from Jules. And Jules says, what is the etymological root of the word dukkha? I think the prefix du is bad. What about the ka? Well, there are differences of opinion on the etymology of the word dukkha because it's not like an ordinary kind of word. One commentarial etymology, which is traditional, is that the du means bad or difficult, and the ka comes from the verb kamadi, which means acceptance or forbearance. Like also the noun kanti would have the same etymology, which is Khanti, or kamadi would be Khamati, I think. So this commentarial explanation is that the du means hard or difficult, and the ka comes from kamadi, to accept, and so it means hard to accept. What is dukkha is hard to accept. Although modern philologists tend not to accept that etymology. So I've read I did a little study on the official etymologies of the word dukkha in this book here, which is the Polytech Society Poly-English Dictionary, which I spent a long time adding to. You can see in the margins, I got all this extra stuff added. See all this extra stuff? Also, the book is like that. So anyway, according to T.W. Rhys Davids and William Steed, who wrote this dictionary, the main probable etymology by modern Western standards is that the du means bad, and the ka is a modification of just the suffix ka in Pali, which doesn't mean much of anything. Sort of like the word for one in Pali is eka, like eka. And the actual Proto-Indo-European root for the number one is manifested just in the e of eka, with the ka at the end. It doesn't really have any meaning. Sometimes it can be used in a derogatory sense or a diminutive. Like a samana is like a philosopher, an ascetic philosopher. A samanaka is sort of like a derogatory, sort of like a so-called philosopher. But here it doesn't really mean much of anything. It's just sort of turning the du into a noun. It's turning a prefix, which means bad, into a noun that just sort of implies badness. And also, there is sort of a modification of it with the KHA to make it sort of a bookend. What's the word? Like a complement of the word sukha, which means like pleasant or ease. I usually define, like if I'm doing a translation, I call sukha ease and dukkha unease. So they sound kind of similar in English as well as in Pali. So that's I think the official definition, at least at the time that the Polytech Society dictionary was composed, is that it's du just means bad. The ka is almost like a meaningless suffix to turn the prefix into a whole word, and then the extra h was added. The k was changed to kh just for the sake of making it sort of mirror the already existing word sukha, which is like happiness or ease or that sort of thing. So that's the real last question. Last time I said that was the last question, I was mistaken. This is the last question. So be happy.